provide substantial evidence, i.e. evidence from adequate and well-controlled studies or evidence from a single, highly persuasive, adequate and well-controlled study that is accompanied by independent findings that substantiate efficacy that eteplirsen is effective for the treatment of DMD. So here again, are there questions to clarify this for the FDA? There are clarifying questions on the part of the panelists. If not, then we'll move to voting. Once again, the question is, do the clinical results of the single historically controlled study, study 201, I'm sorry, there's a question? Yeah?
Yes, forgive me.
Can you identify yourself, please?
My name is Chedi Onyike. To what extent are we to incorporate into this question the testimony of the families, the boys and their families? From my reading of the question, it would seem narrowly worded towards the actual statistical results. So I just want some clarification on that point.
Can the FDA address that question, please?
Well, we are instructed, as people said, to take the views of the patient community into account. It's more on the benefit and the risk. So the statutory standard is more or less as described there, but there is flexibility, and that's where we should take the views of the community into account.
Sorry, if I might just follow on. So if I understand you correctly, this question as worded is really about statistics, is that correct?
Would it be fair to suggest that you should take into account the totality of information in the briefing packet and what's been discussed today?
I think that's fair. The standard is adequate and well-controlled trials, okay? That's what's in the statute, okay? But we are instructed to have flexibility of how we interpret that based on the medical need. So I think, Dr. Alexander, that that's a fair summation. Bob wants to say something.
There are lots of questions raised about the study, whether there was improper influence of the fact that people knew what the study was and all that kind of stuff. You heard testimony from patients who said very explicitly that they didn't think that would alter the level of effort that people made. So those kinds of factors are certainly things that are up for discussion. Now, whether it's persuasive or not, whether the study's persuasive enough, that has a lot to do with the study design and what was measured and all the size of the treatment effect and all those things. But you heard testimony that might affect your views on the quality of the endpoints, on the importance of lack of blinding and all kinds of stuff like that.
Dr. Unger?
Yeah, I think with the majority of the patients here, we have an incredible advantage that in my time at the FDA, it's unprecedented to have basically all the patients here. So that's an important advantage that we have. One of the things that you can do is try to reconcile what you've heard from the patients with the data that you've seen presented by the company. We're hearing patients are improving, doing things, next year that they didn't do last year, and you have to figure out if you can reconcile that with the actual hard data that you've been analyzing today.
Please state your name and question for the record for the FDA clarifying this question.
Paul Rometti, this is directed to Dr. Woodcock, because when I look at this question and I think of the first one we discussed, you're talking about there's some overlap in subjects, but you're talking about two different groups, particularly with the controls. And so I want to understand if we are to consider the dystrophin results, which were tested on some different people than in the 01 or 02, or are we just talking about the other parts of the study?
This is the full approval question, okay, and that is based on the empirical results in the clinic. I agree with what Dr. Unger said. All right, they're not based on the persuasiveness of a surrogate endpoint, right? They're based on the persuasiveness of the trial that was done.
Thank you. One more question of clarification. Please state your name for the record.
Bruce of Yagan. Because I would have two different answers to the questions. One would be objective, one would be subjective, and it's hard to reconcile both in the same question here. That, I guess, is the issue. But
if I may, this is Jerry, and if I may quickly add to that, the question twice mentions well-controlled, and as you've heard repeatedly, people have said that they had trouble with the control. So this well-controlled phrase, in a sense, tips or constrains the question.
I understand a lot of people don't like historically controlled trials. They're not sure they believe they're well controlled. Our regulations since 1970 have said that a historical controlled trial can be a well-controlled study, an adequate and well-controlled study. The question here goes to, do you think under the circumstances that it was? Do you think the way they selected them was right? Do you think the way they analyzed them was right? Good enough to make it an adequate and well-controlled study? That's the question.
Yeah,
But historically controlled trials have been the basis for approval. Sometimes in sort of obvious cases, sometimes in cases that aren't quite as obvious.
Yeah, Billy Dunn. I want to reiterate all of these issues. I think it's very important to take into account the testimony you heard here today, because you've heard half of the comparison. You heard from the patients in the 201-202 trial. They're being compared to a historical control. One of the reasons that I opened up the meeting and many others reiterated the issues that I brought, we spent so much time talking about what substantial evidence is and what adequate and well-controlled studies are, is so that you could sort out whether or not the evidence provided from this study, with the information that you have at hand here from the patients, as well as what's provided by what you refer to as more objective results, rises to the standard that it creates substantial evidence of effectiveness, which again most traditionally is provided by two adequate and well-controlled trials. We did not set out to refute the notion that the historical control was unacceptable by design. I think we took pains to actually illustrate that that was potentially acceptable. What we've done is describe to you the concerns that the team had that have to do with the comparability of that control, the acceptability of the use of that control. So the issue here is that substantial evidence question, and whether or not, in comparison with the group, with all the issues that we've heard and everything you've heard today, it serves to reach that level of evidence.
Thank you. Are there any final questions clarifying this question before we move to voting? Okay, so we'll move to voting then, and I'll read the question. If you voted once, please do so again. And the question is as follows.